Hi, Misha here, and recently I've done fleet looks for Star Trek. The real big one on the Federation, Starfleet, Klingons, Romulans, Dominion, Cardassians. And I kind of do these as I'm dusting things off, and it was time to dust off the Battlestar Galactica collection from eaglemoss. It had a total of 25 standard issues and then 4 special issues. Nothing new to show you, but it's always fun to revisit, talk about things again, right? So let's do that. And the way I've been doing these videos is the first section is more or less talked about in universe, and the second section is the real world perspective and just my thoughts on the actual models themselves. Why not, guys? So with that, let's go and look at the fleet of the 12 colonies of Kobol from before the Cylon War, during the Cylon War, and for decades after the Cylon War. The United Colonial Fleet begins here with the Artemis class. The 12 colonies were spread among 4 tightly packed star systems in essentially a cluster, which meant FTL was really all that required to get from place to place. Of course it was, because space is big, but voyages, or rather jumps, were quite close. And for decades there would be Cold Wars and Hot Wars, Imperial fights and sabotage and collusion. But eventually the colonies would unify, and one of their first projects was to build a new type of warship, a so-called Battlestar. Combination of battleship, battle cruiser, missile frigate, gunboat, and of course carrier. And initially, as Central Command, High Command was being established at PyCon, the colonies would build their own Battlestars. Each would build one of the new Artemis class, and then later the idea was they would be built under a unified Central Command and construction authority. In the beginning, each would be building their own, with Caprica's contribution being the original Galactica. And this would be long before the Cylon War. And one might ask, what was the purpose of these vessels? Well, it was a show of unity, and there would always be concerns about security, pirates, and of course rebel groups, and they're in space. Who knows what could come in? And as often happens with military budgets, sometimes you just have to spend money. Thus, the Artemis class was commissioned originally with 12, later with more. This class was just over a kilometer long at 1,080 meters, about 400 meters wide, including the flight pods, and just over 100 meters tall. She had a standard crew of 3,200 that included not only officers and men to operate the vessel, but also pilots and support crew for fighter craft and other things. Plus, she would routinely carry up to 150 Colonial Marines for defense and boarding actions, police actions, and what have you. Everything was on board, and they thought to put everything they could on her, because these were meant to be all-in-one fleets with the living quarters and other things in the so-called alligator head, command behind that, elements to support combat operations in the middle, flight pods on each side, and of course engines in the rear. It had 6 sublight engines plus thrusters, and of course, for what was at the time a very modern FTL drive system. It also was originally controlled by computers and network software. It was quite a modern vessel, but again, designed more for putting down rebellions, uprisings, or acting as a police craft, anti-piracy craft, security, border control craft, and frankly, to just simply serve as flagships and command ships of the new United Colonial Fleet. She was reasonably quick and had reasonably good armor, since at the time there were no other large capital ships to really challenge her. Speed was slightly emphasized over armor. But of course, she had teeth as well. Beginning at the front and running down the dorsal spine, she had a total of 8 long-range kinetic energy artillery guns, 4 heavy artillery kinetic energy turrets, 16 smaller, lighter turrets often used for point defense. Some of these would be mounted on the flight pods, plus small guns to provide a flak screen if necessary. So we see long range and medium range and close range weapons. And on her underside, her ventral side, we have multiple missile launch tubes, primarily intended for conventional ordnance, although they could be retrofitted, as we'll soon see, for nuclear warheads as well. Focusing in on the flight pods themselves, they were both fixed in place with launch tubes for a new type of starfighter, a new generation, a new class known as a Viper. Standard capacity would be 2 squadrons, so 1 stationed per tube, although she could carry more for special missions or for rescue operations, up to at least 4 squadrons. In addition, she would carry support craft such as shuttles and diplomatic and even small other FTL-capable vessels. But typically, she launched Vipers. So now, let's talk about those. After all, what is a carrier without aircraft, or in this case, spacecraft, to carry? The Viper Mark I, named after an atmospheric earlier fighter, also known as a Viper, used in the colonies, primarily Caprica, but a few others. Whereas the early Viper was primarily meant to operate in atmosphere, the Space Superiority Viper here was primarily intended to operate in space. It could operate in an atmosphere, but it would suffer immensely at the cost of fuel, because it would have to burn all the time to maintain speed and altitude. Of course, in space, once you get going, there you go. And this was reasonably fast for the day and time, thanks to its 3 engines, capable of achieving at least 320 meters per second acceleration, again on a burn. It was 9 meters long, 6 meters wide, and just over 4 meters tall. It had a single occupancy cockpit. However, there was a large storage compartment for cargo, supplies, that kind of thing behind, and in a tight pinch, this compartment could be converted to allow 1 more person to sit back here. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it would work in a pinch. Sometimes this would also be done for reconnaissance missions. It was not FTO capable, of course, for a craft of this size, but it was designed to be maneuverable, and it did have a bit of an armored hull. Primary armaments right here. We have 2 KDM Arrow kinetic cannon, rapid fire, tied to advanced targeting via computer. And the cockpit was primarily digital with only limited analog control for backup purposes. It could, in a pinch, carry missiles under the wings, but it really wasn't designed for that. Again, kind of an anti-piracy, border security craft. And it did not have an internal bay. Rather than an internal weapons bay, yeah, we had the storage compartment behind the pilot. And these were launched from tubes from the Artemis-class Battlestar, although they could land and take off independently as well, even from an atmosphere, but it would not be ideal for all that. So they do have landing gear, and of course they had networking, and they typically operated in squadrons of either 10 or 12, although they could operate in larger squadrons if necessary for certain missions, and at other times they would operate in pairs for CAP, combat air patrols. And these would be manufactured at more than one colony and would be a standard throughout the fleet, and the first in a generation of fighters designed specifically to work with the new Battlestar type warships. But that's just the beginning. Perhaps just as important as the Viper to Battlestar were its complement of shuttles. This is considered the Aero Shuttle or Atmospheric Shuttle Mark I, and it was a general utility craft designed primarily during peacetime to pretty much convey anything ship to ship, ship to surface, or surface to ship, to be very flexible. It's about 20.5 meters long, about 10 3/4 meters wide, and has basically 2 compartments: a forward cockpit with seating for 2 as standard, pilot and co-pilot, or pilot and cargo chief, and then a large cabin in the rear that can carry a large number of really anything. 24 passengers in comfortable seats with a couple of attendants, or in a military police situation, 40 armed troops or police officers, law enforcement. Could also carry prisoners back, and it could carry up to 100 metric tons total without passengers. It has 2 primary sublight engines, but originally was not capable of FTL, and by and large these were not armed, although they did have basic armor for defense, not just against enemy fighters or enemy craft, but even just things in space, rocks, asteroids, meteors, that kind of thing. Pays to have shielding of some type in space. And any capital ship would carry several of these, and there was a slightly smaller version as well, used by smaller vessels and also just used when needed. But this was the bigger one, and one that would remain in service for decades. Not long after the colonies unified and had their own military, again the headquarters at PyCon and primary construction and fleet refurbishment at the Scorpia shipyards, the Cylons would initiate a war. And in the beginning, the Artemis-class Battlestar would be the frontline warship, command ship, leading groups, and the Viper Mark I would be its primary fighter. But there would be other support craft used, and they would quickly run into a problem with the Cylons and their reliance on computers. The issue with fighting an enemy like the Cylons, you were fighting computers, and very quickly they learned to exploit your computers, especially ones using Wi-Fi, wireless, networking. Didn't really matter the security protocols or the firewalls. They would usually find a way to punch through. This required de-emphasizing electronics, assistance, anything related to artificial intelligence on board the original Battlestar and Viper. But soon designers would produce the Viper Mark II light starfighter, space superiority fighter. And this was produced with two goals in mind. One, to make it Cylon proof, tampering proof. Two, streamline it for large-scale war mass production. The Mark I was great for peacetime. The Mark II was refined for wartime. These required fewer resources to produce and could be turned out at a much faster rate. They were simplified. They had virtually no computers on board. They had a nearly entirely analog cockpit with analog controls. So faster, easier to produce with all the mechanics. And because of that, the Cylons could not hack them. They were a little smaller too, at about 8.5 meters and about 4 and 3/4 meters wide and about 2 and 3/4 meters tall. So smaller. They still had 3 sublight engines, and they were able to achieve more thrust, 360 to 380 meters per second acceleration. Now these were powered by nuclear reaction, which the fuel on board the nuclear reactors were good for about 12 years before being topped off. However, for the engines themselves, some type of reaction mass was needed. This did give it a limitation with onboard fuel and acceleration. It could accelerate at 1 G for about 32 hours constant, or 7 Gs, which is its max safe acceleration, for 30 minutes at constant. But of course, again, in space, once you get going, you're going. So there you go. Whereas the original Viper was armed with 20mm auto-fire type cannons, kinetic energy, the Mark II was armed with Mech A6 30mm cannon, 800 rounds each. So quite a hard-hitting punch. In addition, it was designed to carry up to 8 missiles. Often these were of the Javelin type, and it could carry 2 in an internal weapons bay underneath, and it could carry 3 in an external weapons pod, 1 under each wing, giving it more capability in the missile front than the previous Mark I, and it was a cheaper fighter to produce, which does explain a bit more of the boxy lines, but greater acceleration, greater maneuverability, agility, but very little target assistance and control for the pilot there. It all had to be done manually. It carried 6 days emergency supplies if it were to crash somewhere, oxygen, food, rations. So that was always what had to be concerned during the war, but that was about its only cargo ability, was emergency supplies for the pilot. And these could operate in squadrons of 8 or 16 as usual, depending on the type, although this could be flexible depending on the mission. And along with the Mark I, it would be technically downgraded for the war. These would serve aboard the Artemis class Battlestar, and they would launch from tubes all the same. First put into production early on during the Cylon War, we have the Orion class Battlestar. And the name Battlestar was quite probably applied to this as more of a propaganda morale thing. It was often considered a pocket Battlestar because this was the smallest type of ship to bear the name. In reality, it was probably closer to a frigate. Nevertheless, it was a good craft for its intended role, and it did serve throughout the entire war, and it did pioneer some new technologies. The Orion class was about 420 meters long, but of course, as you see, quite narrow and stripped down with a lot of exposed hardware. It had 4 primary sublight engines, and of course maneuvering thrusters besides, and it was jump capable. It had a standard crew of just 150, so it was quite efficient there, plus any supporting crew if it were to have a flight group embarked. It could carry 1 squadron of Vipers, plus a small number of shuttles or other support craft, but that's it. So we have 1 flight deck. Not bad though for its size, frankly. And it was relatively well armed for its size as well. It had 12 primary kinetic weapons, basically long-range artillery pieces for its size again. But it also had 32 CIWS, close-in missile defense batteries. And it had 4 primary missile tubes for launching conventional cruise missiles and thermonuclear missiles. Unlike the original Artemis, this was designed to launch nukes if and when needed. Although, conventionally, missiles would be normal. It also had the ability to put up a flak screen for defense. The CIWS batteries were calibrated to shoot down enemy missiles as well as enemy fighters, enemy raiders too. And it has a few interesting features because of its intended role in the fleet. When introduced, it had about the most advanced, precise, and long-range DRADIS system available. It also had a new experimental coating to the hull to make it less visible or even stealthy to enemy DRADIS. And the reason it was designed this way, this was meant to operate, yes, to support larger Battlestars and work in a group, but also it was intended for scouting missions on its own or with a small group, as well as reconnaissance / spy surveillance missions, situations where it needed to zip in undetected, scan, and zip out. So kind of pre-battle assessment or post-battle analysis missions, which were always dangerous. So it was quite flexible in the fleet, and of course these could be used to defend installations, and they were much faster and easier to produce than an Artemis class, and they were far less resource intensive when it came to personnel, as you might imagine. The downside, this had virtually no hull armor. It would rely on maneuverability and speed, plus its stealth, to avoid being shot at. But if it were hit, especially by a missile, it would be crippled or even destroyed. So that's the trade-off for the lower cost. And of course, accommodations inside for the crew were Spartan and cramped, to say the least. Essentially, it was a terrestrial submarine inside, with many exposed conduits, ductwork, piping, even electrical systems. But since it was put into production during the Cylon War, It was not vulnerable to hacking. It had very few network computer systems on board, very rudimentary computers for firing solutions. It did not rely on computers to maintain its stealth. Really, what computing power it had was isolated and dedicated to the DRADIS and long-range communications and analysis sensors. A very interesting vessel that served well in the fleet, and I won't say it only served one role, but it was designed to fill 3 or 4 roles very well. But beyond that, well, couldn't really do much. But very important, and this allowed the colonies to field a large force very quickly after the war began. So early on, the first few years of the war, we had Viper Mark 1s and Mark 2s. We had the large Artemis Battlestar, and we had the small pocket Orion class Battlestar. But as the old saying goes, an army marches on its stomach. To that end, we have the Loki, if you prefer, class cruiser. And while this had weapons, that was not its goal, that was not its purpose. This was a supply, redistribution, and repair vessel, a support ship for the Colonial fleet. Measuring in at 720 meters, it was larger than an Orion, but smaller than an Artemis. In fact, we're kind of right in the middle. But it was given over to its 81 separate cargo bays. And it had a distributing system where it could easily access any bay with a crane with a rotating cylinder, plus additional storage in the engine nacelles. It was powered by 9 sublight engines. They were a little smaller, yes, but also because of the weight, this could carry many thousand metric tons of just about anything. Bullets, food, gear for pilots, even parts for Vipers, even armor plating to slap on to damaged ships in the field. Its crew was highly variable, but it only required about 200 to operate, although many more were required to accurately manage and move and deliver the cargo. So it could easily bounce up to several hundred, even 1,000 if necessary. Heck, in a pinch, this could carry crew to resupply vessels. Very versatile. It had one large flight deck, typically equipped with shuttles, but in a pinch it could house Raptors or Vipers. We'll get to Raptors in a bit. It was, of course, FTL capable, and it had better armor than the Orion, but it wasn't expected to be in frontline duty. It was there as a support ship to operate before or after a battle, or at the very most to be at the end of a fleet, end of an action. However, it was armed for defense. Located entirely on the Alligator Head, there were 35 kinetic energy weapons, cannons, some medium, some light, plus it had small flak batteries scattered throughout as well. These would be produced throughout the war, serving for a very long time. It was a cargo ferry, and the fleet was definitely better for it. The Artemis class Battlestar served admirably well as the centerpiece of a Battlestar group during the first few years of the war, but it was designed in peacetime for somewhat different purpose and had to be hastily retrofit to defend against the Cylons. And also, many of the original Artemis class were lost during the first 3-4 years of the war, including the original Galactica. It was actually lost in a valiant defense of civilians trying to make it to Caprica, caught in the middle of the war. And Orions just couldn't cut it. So just as the Viper Mark I gave way to the Viper Mark II, in the first few years of the war, a new battlestar was designed, the Jupiter class. And in honor of the original Galactica, Caprica's first member would be named Galactica 2. And much as with the original scheme, each colony would fund producing their own Jupiter-type battlestar, meaning the initial launch was for 12, but dozens more would be built in the next 6-7 years of the war. And this was, quite frankly, a beast. Whereas pre-war ships were elegant and computer-designed, clean, this was designed during a war, on a budget, down and dirty, very simple, and very basic to combat the Cylons and to keep it on budget. They did not have time. They needed these yesterday. So fitting out, testing, commissioning, and shakedown cruises were very brief. Like I said, Galactica was one of the first Jupiters, technically a Mark I. There would also be the Arcturus and the Columbia, as well as many others serving in the war. This was simply designed to be a tank, to take a hit and keep on hitting back and carry as many fighters as was humanly possible. It was about 1,445 meters long and 540 meters wide standard. When fully loaded with fighters and Marines, it supported a crew of 5,000. And in places, it had nearly double the armor of the original types of Battlestar. So it could take a hit even from a missile, even a nuke. Wouldn't be pretty, but it could take one. And most of the armor was focused on the flight pods and the dorsal, also the bow, leaving the underside still armored, certainly not as weak as the Orion, but it had to be left unarmored somewhere, kind of an all-or-nothing armor scheme. And we had these as a primary sublight engine, and of course it had an FTL drive. It was not the most advanced FTL, but it was damn reliable. And much like the Vipers, it would receive primary power through nuclear reaction, although it would use Thallium or Thallium, if you prefer, to fund the FTL drives and some other systems. And it had decent crew quarters as well as training facilities for pilots, but it was a warship, so maybe not as Spartan as the Orion inside. It wasn't exactly luxurious or sleek. But this was a warship. It could defend itself, but offense was the name of the game. Much like with the armor, primary weapons batteries were on the head and the spine. It had 40 primary kinetic energy weapons, long-range artillery pieces. Remember, the original had 8 of one type and 4 of another, plus several medium batteries, close-in support defense weapons, point defense, and lots of flak. So it had guns of all size. In addition, it had multiple missile launch tubes, again, also capable of launching thermonuclear tipped missiles, although this usually was the case. Conventional ordnance were usually the name of the game. But the other part of its offense was, of course, its contingent of Vipers. It could carry more than double what the original Artemis could, with each flight pod routinely carrying 40 Vipers for a total of 80. But that's standard. It could actually carry more in a pinch, quite a few more, but that was the standard. And of course there would also be facilities for spares to be assembled on board and repair existing. It also had more facilities to work with shuttles and Raptors, and it could even house medium-sized, jump-capable civilian transports and military transports in the flight pods as well, because they're quite massive. And it had a new feature designed for both defense and for more efficient jumping. When in combat, the flight pods were fully deployed to get them away from the main hull. But when it would jump, they would retract in, making things easier and quicker for the jump calculations. An interesting feature that they tried with this. But otherwise, it was just a piece of steel in space. It could take a hit, it could deliver a hit, keep on going. The one area it did lose out to the Artemis: speed and maneuverability. It only had about 3/4 of the acceleration, even less when the Mark II would come out. Later on in the war, later production variants could have additional armor plating slapped on, and even additional or rearranged gun and or missile batteries. The Galactica herself would start off with the original Mark I configuration, but after receiving damage at the Battle of Cancerous during her refit, she would actually get the effectively Mark II updates. At this point, this is a true battleship, slow and steady, commanding and forming the center point of a fleet. And while Viper Mark I's did serve on her early in the war, the Mark II would be the name of the game here. That would be the primary fighter for the Jupiter type Battlestar. And this would be the jewel of the fleet. While the Artemis was probably more common throughout the war, this was the true hope of the fleet and really what gave the colonies an edge. And these would be the stars of the war. And they would earn a name for themselves. But many were lost tragically, as you would expect. But some would survive on. The Viper Mark II was an excellent space superiority light starfighter, but it was a light starfighter. The Raptor was a very good multi-purpose craft, but it was not a combat fighter. So in the last years of the war, after 8 or 9 years of fighting, the Viper Mark III was introduced. And this was classified not as a space superiority fighter, but rather as a multi-role fighter, or a strike fighter. Because, well, it was intended for multiple things. And it was a larger, beefier bird besides. At over 10.5 meters long and over 6 3/4 meters wide and 4 meters tall, this was a much more massive ship than the Mark II, even than the Mark I. To make up for that, it did have newer, heavier thrust main engines, but nevertheless it had lower acceleration than the Mark II. But the trade-off, first, it had heavier armor, and it had better sensors. In fact, while it didn't exactly have advanced computer systems in the cockpit, after fighting the Cylons for so long, the colony scientists really kind of knew the line, so they pushed it. There was more automation and more isolated, non-networked, non-Wi-Fi computer systems for better targeting, and just basically better set awareness, because with the Mark II there was a lot on the single pilot to keep track of, so this was designed to alleviate his workload, which again kind of plays part in this being a multi-role craft, not just a fighter. To begin, it has two 30mm Mech A6B autocannon, updated version of the one used on the Mark II, still using the same ammunition. It does have 1,000 rounds per gun though, instead of 800. But its main claim to fame was its ability to carry missiles or torpedoes or even sensor pods or jamming pods. It had 2 internal bays instead of 1 on the Mark II, and it could carry heavier payloads externally under the wings, meaning it could carry up to 12 Javelin guided missiles, it could carry rocket pods, unguided rockets, and it could carry nuclear tipped tactical missiles as well. It could even carry an anti-shipping torpedo in a pinch. Of course, again, at the trade-off of some maneuverability and speed over the Mark II. And it was more complicated to produce, took more time, more resources. So it was never really intended for the Viper Mark III to completely replace the Mark II, not like the Mark II replaced the Mark I. This was to really, complement it. And unlike the Raptor, it could defend itself and hopefully get in and out better. The trade-off was, even though this could launch from tubes like other Vipers, because of its larger size and heavier mass, if a vessel was meant to have the Mark III on board, the tubes would have to be updated and modified along with the Viper stacks. It was not compatible with the Artemis, but it could work in the Jupiter, and actually could even be fitted to the Orion pocket Battlestar, although it could only carry a small number because of, its size, as it were. These saw prominent use in the last 2 years of the war, and were part of the Colonial efforts to have the next, really the 3rd generation of combat craft to not only fight, but finally beat the Cylons. After a decade of fighting, humans were getting tired, even if robots weren't. And really, to go alongside the new Viper, it's time for a new Battlestar. Meet the most successful Battlestar of all time, the Valkyrie class, also sometimes known to some in the colonies as the Odin class. This was a jack of all trades, but interestingly, it seemed to master them too. It was an in-between vessel built with the lessons learned from the war, and hard fought, but well learned at that. And these would be introduced 3 or 4 years before war's end, the armistice, and Valkyrie herself would be the first, and actually would be quite famous. She would also be damaged at the Battle of Cancerous Prime, along with others, and this would lead to her destruction being faked and her crew's deaths being faked, so that the Valkyrie could be part of the so-called Ghost Fleet, an effort to end the war that was actually very successful. But we'll get to that in a minute. First, let's talk about this new class of support Battlestar. The Valkyrie class was about 650 meters long and about 235 meters wide. And she was quite short at about 70 meters. But that belies a lot of her abilities. She had a full standard crew, including flight crews and pilots, of 1,750. And her standard complement was 20 Vipers, and she was designed from the ground up to work with the new Mark III, but also could accommodate the Mark II. She also could support several squadrons of Raptors. Then again, Raptors usually operated in squadrons of 2 or 3, so there you go. And shuttles. Her flight decks and flight pods were interestingly arranged in a more vertical pattern as opposed to horizontal on the Galactica. So this allowed for quicker launching. She could easily launch half a dozen at a time, and she had regular recovery facilities. She had 4 sublight engines. She actually had a very advanced FTL for the day and time, the best the colonies could do. She was also fitted with the best Dratus that could be mustered, finally kind of outstripping the Orion for this title. Had very good range and accuracy. Very reliable system. And she was quite fast to accelerate and very, very maneuverable. But because of her size and everything, she was classed not as a full command or flag Battlestar, but as a support Battlestar. Frankly, she would be considered a heavy cruiser. And she did lack armor, no bones about it. Her dorsal sections and front end and flight pods were relatively well armored, but her underside, much like the Orion, was virtually unarmored. This all-or-nothing armor scheme was again done to give her some agility. The downside was it left some key systems, namely the FTL spools, exposed. So the best thing was turn and don't let the enemy point at them, or operate in groups, because these were meant to be grouped together, as well as work alongside the Jupiter and the few remaining Artemis classes. So this might not sound so interesting, but where she really does shine is with her offensive capabilities. Meter for meter, she had more guns, more ordnance per square meter than any other warship. She had 20 primary guns, kinetic weapons, and 33 additional kinetic weapons and turrets, and these were dual purpose turrets that also could launch missiles. These are primarily missiles intended as part of the CWIS system to defend against other missiles coming in or fighters, but were designed with their targeting systems to be quite flexible. And if that's not enough, she had 6 large missile tubes, silos, again for conventional or nuclear weapons. And on top of all that, she had several small, light, rapid-fire kinetic guns, plus flak batteries. So, yeah, you do the math. They put as many guns on her as possible, and that combined with speed was meant to be her defense. And this was about the most advanced Battlestar to come out of the Cylon War. And she was designed for mass production, and even though she was only around for a couple of years, they managed to turn out dozens of these between the 12 colonies during that time. And she was a great supplement ship to Battlestar groups with Jupiters at their core. And these were often used in pairs of 2 or 3 to protect planets, space stations, troop transports, thallium ore operation, mining operations, what have you. She was a very well-balanced vessel, and her interior was not near as cramped as the Orion, and not quite as stark and Spartan as the Jupiter. Because she was made later on, there was a little less pressure to build these than some of the other ones. And unlike the Artemis, which they found really couldn't all that easily be upgraded, even if it was a reliable space frame, the Valkyrie was designed for long-term service. It was designed to be easily updated, modernized, and customized, and it certainly would be for many years to come. In fact, it was considered quite a plum assignment for up-and-coming officers. But first, of course, we have to end the war. As I said, the Ghost Fleet offensive would come about in the last 2 years of the war. They would surreptitiously collect ships, Battlestars, support ships, fighters, crew, all written off, all very convincingly passed off as destroyed and deceased to the Cylons. And very surreptitiously based in near Cylon-controlled space. When the offensive launched, the colony would take over 5 sectors of Cylon space, doing much damage. And if you can shake the confidence of a machine, shaking the confidence of a machine, the war would continue on for a few more months, but it wouldn't be long before the Cylons would back off and an armistice would be signed, and the war would be over after 12 years of fighting. The Cylons retreated to their side, the colonies retreated to theirs, and both would watch each other with mistrust, but without firing a shot. Armistice Station would be established for peace, and for years the Cylons would not send anyone there as a representative, and peace would continue. Civilian trade and commerce would flourish, politics would go on, and of course the Colonial military would be downsized, but still, because the Cylon threat is there and we have effectively what is a Cold War, they would continue and they would advance. As you would imagine, during the war, production of civilian commercial vessels was severely curtailed, and even worse for the private sector, most were co-opted to be used as troop transports, hospital ships, supply ships, or just VIP transports themselves. And one type here is the Astral type. This was a luxury liner before and after the war. And during the war, yes, it was used as a troop transport. It was designed to carry 300 to 400 passengers in luxury, but when it came time for troops, it could carry up to 1,500. It only required a crew of about 14 to operate, plus around a dozen more cargo attendants and what have you. It was FTO capable. It had 3 sublight engines. Because it was designed as a liner, it was quite fast at sublight speeds, but not all that maneuverable. Of course, it wasn't armored, and it wasn't armed, aside from the ability to launch flares. And it was able to not only dock to space stations, but also land on planets. So, after the war's end, vessels like this were seen in space lanes again and were allowed to resume their original purposes, although some, worn out from use in the war, would never return to being liners, but rather would be sold off to be repurposed as freighters, even prison barges. You can tell I've been talking for a while. Quite famously, the Astral Queen herself. Another famous and popular civilian private sector vessel that was used for decades before the war and decades after was the Eversun Clipper. This was commonly used for planet-to-planet transport. Not really in luxury, but it could carry up to 150 passengers routinely, 400 or 500 in an emergency, plus several thousand metric tons of cargo. It had 4 cargo bays and a small docking bay for shuttles. It was quite long at 277 meters, so technically longer than the Astral type itself at about 260 meters, but as you can tell, also quite narrow. It too was FTL capable and could easily land on a planet, which was kind of part of its average duties. This was typically used to transport from one planet to another directly without need of a space station or other transfer point. It too only had the minimum amount of armor for space travel and was not armed. Even during the war, when these were purposed by the colonial military, they were typically used as transports for generals and personnel or as light troop transports in hospital, but mainly they were used for supply ships because while it couldn't carry that many passengers, it could actually carry a good number of boxes of this and that. It did have small VIP quarters at the front, but most were expected to sit in the general crew cabin, whereas the Astral type was expected to be in space for days or weeks. This was expected for hours, maybe a couple of days at most, so wasn't really provisioned for much more than that. But a very, very common sight in space lanes for over 60 yarns. But with that, let's get back to the military. Now, at last, we can talk about the Colonial Raptor. And there are 2 major configuration variants, the Utility Raptor and the Assault, sometimes informally the Heavy Raptor. But let's begin with the Utility. This was introduced at the tail end of the Cylon War, quite probably the second to last or even final year, as it marked quite a leap forward in colonial technology, especially when it comes to miniaturization. Now, there was a previous Raptor, so one might think this as the Mark II, but the name was never actually used. It was just the Raptor. The original first generation was quite similar, slightly elongated, and the engines were carried in pivoting nacelles outboard of the fuselage, and it was an FTL incapable craft. It could not go to light speed. It was sublight only. In place, it had a turret at the rear with a swiveling cannon that could be aimed below it. And it was designed as a transport and assault craft, but not having FTL really limited its ability there because it had to operate from a support ship. This second generation, though, moved the sublight engines into the main fuselage, got rid of the rear turreted gunner's position, shrunk the cabin a bit, but most importantly, introduced a very compact FTL, a jump drive spool system. This made the craft infinitely more useful, gave it semi-autonomous operations, and really expanded its roles. We see these used in the final months of the war, and it would continue to see service for decades afterwards, and of course it would continue to see upgrades and optimizations because this was a very adaptable craft. Although some might think of it as ugly or homely because of its squat, solid design, and it was sometimes derided by Viper pilots because it wasn't fast. The original the original Raptor with the nacelle-mounted sublight engines was only capable of accelerating about 300 meters per second. Later versions, especially the utility, were able to achieve about 340. Of course, as you hang more stuff off of it, this would drop down to 320 quite quickly. It was capable of maneuvering thanks to thrusters and variable things, and it was VTOL and VSTOL capable as well. Unlike the Viper, which could only operate in atmosphere on limited profiles, this was designed to operate in atmosphere more like a shuttle. Now, just like with the Viper, it had to burn reaction mass constantly in an atmosphere, so this did give some limitations, but it was more optimized for it than a Viper because of its role. And frankly, just the way it took off and landed from Battlestars and other Colonial vessels. And because of its need to work from carriers, it was made as compact and as light as possible while still achieving its role. The Raptor was smaller than you might think. It was about 8.6 meters long, so just slightly longer than a Viper Mark II. And it was about 5.6 meters wide, not counting anything mounted on the winglet tips. And it was only about 3 meters tall, again without anything mounted, kind of bumping it up. And it weighed roughly 5,000 tons dry and had a standard crew of 2. In the utility version here, it could either be pilot or co-pilot. This would be when it would be used for general transport, general cargo. It had a front cockpit section, and then there was a bulkhead, and then there was a rear cabin section. When transporting cargo, they could use it for that. You could also depressurize the cabin for spaceborne operations. It took about 10 seconds to repressurize. When carrying standard passengers, civilians, or just non-combatants, it could carry roughly 10 in the back. Or if you wanted to carry fully equipped Marines with supplies, it could carry up to 8, although they would be rather cozy in there. To get in, there was a door on the port side, and there was a second door, or rather hatch, on the underside. This could be used for spaceborne operations, emergency egress, or it could be used for boarding operations. In fact, it had an extendable skirt so that a pressurized cavity could be created to drill into the hull of a station or ship, because it could also serve as a marine transport. Of course, we also see the utility version used by civilian organizations and militaries, for that matter, is even ambulances. There's room in the back for at least 2 stretchers with attendants, maybe 3 in a pinch. And for defense, usually this version was unarmed, although these rear projections were chaff and flare dispensers as standard. Had decent hull armor for what it was. And like I said, it was VSTOL and VTOL capable. In an atmosphere, its standard cruise was about Mach 2.5. but it could accelerate to much greater than that, well over 100 times the speed of sound, but this would burn fuel at a much increased rate. Maximum acceleration was 6 Gs, much like with the Viper at 7 Gs. This would burn fuel faster. At 1 G acceleration in space, it could go for well over 48 hours though. It had supplies on board for the 2 crew of up to 30 days, so it could go on long-range missions, or if stranded somewhere, survive. And that's because, like I said, this had a compact FTL spool drive system, but it was limited to roughly 10 jumps, separate jumps, and the range was somewhat limited. Part of it was the drive itself, but a good portion was the limited computer systems. To calculate longer jumps, you need more computer power, and well, you can understand why with the Cylons around, they didn't want to do that. So it had a rudimentary computer that was pretty much hack-proof, but meant that it could only calculate relatively short jumps. But considering that previous smaller vessels like this did not have jump drive at all, this allowed it to act independent from the fleet. So what could you do with the utility Raptor? So putting aside civilian uses in general transport and personnel transport and all that, it acted in the fleet as a reconnaissance craft and scout craft. It had quite good short to medium range sensors. It could detect EM transmissions. It could detect natural deposits of ore, water, other materials. So it could scan for things, scout around. It could try to do the enemy fleet. In addition to the chaff and flare, the hull was designed in such a way and made of a certain material to make it DRADIS absorbent and also reflective, kind of based on some of the technology pioneered in the Orion. It wasn't foolproof and it could be detected, but it helped. It could sneak in. Its small size also helped. When operating more at the fleet, it served as an electronic warfare craft, or electronic countermeasures, ECM craft, and then the second person in the cockpit would be the ECO, the electronic countermeasures officer. It could have internal equipment. It could also mount jamming pods on the winglets, up to 4 of them. It could also mount decoy drones, up to 6, 3 under each wing. It could also mount communications pods / drones, things of that nature. It was quite good at scrambling the guidance systems of missiles incoming. It also was good at scrambling transmissions from enemy vessels or securing transmissions from friendly vessels. It could also serve as a IFF, friend or foe, designator for Vipers, and it could work alongside Vipers quite well, again providing early warning capabilities, scrambling enemy missiles, as I mentioned. It could also use a laser designator to paint targets for the Vipers to home in on. But again, the standard utility was not fitted with weapons, but they could certainly be mounted. The Assault Raptor, nicknamed the Heavy Raptor, perhaps more strongly inspired by the Cylon War flying pillbox with the Toaster Slayer cannon. This is certainly one in a more aggressive standpoint. As for the body, it had additional armor plating, at least it could have. And because of everything it's carrying, it typically did not have much in the way of crew in the back. Usually that room was reserved for supplies or a fuel tank to extend its abilities, with additional thallium on board, thallium, tomato, tomato, potato, potato. It could make up to 20 separate jumps, extending its range. But really, armament was the name of the game here. This too could paint targets with a laser, and it did still have very good sensors, which can always help. On the fuselage, or at least internally mounted, it could carry two 30mm Mech A14 cannon, each with 800 rounds. So with the same caliber as the Viper Mark II and III. The utility Raptor could also have these sometimes as just light defense. But in addition to that, on the outboard wing tips, it could carry additional cannon. These would be the somewhat lighter 20mm, originally the same caliber used in the Viper Mark I, but they were belt fed with 3,000 rounds each. So smaller bullets, but they shoot them really fast, and there's a lot of them, giving it over 7,500 rounds in total with a light and a heavy hitting gun. Now there's 3 hard points under each wing, plus 2 additional hard points mounted above the fuselage, and we have a large internal weapons bay, very much like the Viper Mark III. This would essentially be what would take the place of the crew area. And in that bay, you could have a fuel tank. You could carry up to 2 anti-ship tactical nuclear weapons. Or you could carry 4 long-range guided missiles, or 8 short-range, so the Javelin-type guided missiles. Although that was usually not done. Typically the internal bay was for heavy ordnance. You could also carry more conventional bombs there as well. But more in the assault role and close support role, we had other things. For example, there were missile pods, kind of a Sea Whiz system, small missiles mounted up there, 12 each per pod. These could shoot down enemy fighters, enemy missiles, or harass larger vessels. Then, under the wings, we have dumbfire rocket pods. Where are they at? Right there. That's the missile. They're there. Each pod could hold up to 240 small-scale rockets. Of course, there were different calibers too, so larger you get fewer, and they were rapid fire. Typically, they were shot in bursts of 20. And then finally, outboard here, we have a cluster of 4 short-range Javelin missiles. In their place, you could carry 2 medium-range guided missiles or 1 long-range missile. So you had some options. This was very, very flexible. So we had a total of 8 external hardpoints plus a large internal bay. And again, this could fly in an atmosphere. And of course, with the weapons, instead of having an eco in the cockpit, we have a WISO, we have a weapons systems officer trained for the guided and unguided. So this could be configured to attack capital ships or to support Vipers by launching missiles of its own, because again, the Viper Mark I had very limited missile capability. The Mark II was better. The Mark III could carry a decent number of missiles, but was kind of a limited thing, a multi-role purpose thing, just like the Raptor. But yeah, and of course this could also carry additional chaff and flare pods, up to 4 of them, plus the 2 in the back. And you could mix and match between assault and utility. Really, the only difference internally would have been the base storage and the added armor, which, yes, this would be a little slower, but it could pack a big punch considering its relatively small size. Unlike the Viper, the Raptor operated from the flight deck, so typically the forward part of the flight pod as opposed to the side tubes from the Vipers. It was mostly due to its shape. It wasn't designed to be launched out of a tube. It wasn't near as aerodynamic. Needed a little slower acceleration, as you might imagine. And then, of course, had to be guided in. And Raptors of one type or another could operate on pretty much every Battlestar. They were designed from the Jupiter onward, and they could even be fitted in with the Artemis class if there were still any surviving at that time, because they would operate with similar facilities as shuttles. This is as good a time as any to say that the shuttles themselves, after the war, would benefit from the compact, miniaturized jump drive system, FTL system, pioneered in the Raptors. So later versions of the atmospheric shuttle would get pretty much the same system, although often it was more the civilian type, giving them much greater range. Now, of course, the shuttle could still carry a lot more. Like I said, the utility Raptor could carry 8 Marines or 10 passengers, whereas the shuttle could carry up to 40 passengers and easily 24 fully equipped Marines, 30, 32 if they don't mind standing. So you still have a lot greater ability, but then again, the shuttle is not armed. This is armed. And again, it provided electronic warfare abilities, basically functioning in the fleet as an AWACS or whatever they needed, but also able to land on a planet, deliver Marines, support the troops, shoot some toasters, whatever. And this is why it stayed in service and continued to see upgrades for decades. Again, a lot of times Viper pilots would deride these right up until they needed them. They were often used for search and rescue when they were downed Viper pilots, so they were welcome then. And Marines and ground pounders always loved them because they like anyone that provides close air support. So it had a good reputation. It really did, even if some Viper jocks didn't want to admit it publicly. Let's talk disposition of the Vipers at the end of the Cylon War. Most Mark I's had been phased out or lost in combat or retired to second-line reserve, leaving the Mark II, the venerable bird introduced at the beginning of the war, to really carry most of the fleet. Though in the last 2 years the Mark III helped out, it was considered a multi-role craft. It was quite large. It was good at the ordnance level, but with the introduction of the second variant of the Raptor, kind of able to do a lot of its goals but better, it was of a limited use. Plus it was more expensive and time consuming to produce, and its heavier reliance on electronics made many nervous. My point is, at the end of the day, the Mark III, while it was not a failure, wasn't all it was cracked up to be. In fact, several battle groups went back to using the Mark II now that the need for delivering heavy ordnance was less. There was an armistice. Like I said earlier, the Cylons went to their side, the colonies were on theirs, and at first many couldn't believe peace had happened. But as years would roll by, people would get comfortable, and the military budget would be cut but not taken away entirely, and development would continue because everyone knew at any moment the war could start up again. And it was this ever-looming threat that kept Viper design moving forward. Until we get to the standard fleet fighter, the Viper Mark VII. But what about Mark 4, 5, and 6? The Mark IV was interesting. Designed shortly after the end of the war, it really focused on improving the range, endurance, and atmospheric performance, because now, like the Mark I, these would revert to being more peacekeeping, border security, patrol craft, and so being able to more efficiently operate in the atmosphere was beneficial. The Mark IV was produced in some numbers, but it was peacetime, so they weren't huge. The Mark V and the Mark VI, though, barely got off the drawing board for different reasons. The Mark V was an attempt to push the avionics forward, and during flight testing there was a limited production run. During testing, the Mark V was frankly a disappointment, and this would lead directly to the Mark VI, which was one of the attempts to go back to some more computerized systems, computerized displays, automation in the cockpit, weapons guidance, battlefield awareness, kind of drawing upon the Mark III. As I said a minute ago, some in the colonies were nervous about putting computers in the Mark III, and to be fair, some were exploited by the Cylons, so the Mark VI was to expand computer usage, but also they were better protected with newer firewall systems. The Mark VI doesn't seem to have made it much past the prototype stage. It was more of a test, a concept. Again, we're at a peacetime budget, but it would directly lead to the Mark VII here. In fact, lessons learned from all previous Vipers would be combined into this. And this was not classed as a space superiority like the Mark II, but no, more like the Mark III. The Mark VII was classed as a multi-role, a jack of all trades. And it actually did achieve them. And it really was a technological leap forward. Dimensionally, it was in between the Marks II and III. It was about 9.9 meters long, so definitely shorter than the III, but over a meter longer than the II. Had a wingspan of a little over 5.6 meters, and it was just under 3 meters tall. It did not have FTO capability like all previous Vipers. Had hull armor as standard. The engines were updated, kind of learning from the Mark IV. They had newer thrust vectoring. They were powered by a thallium reactive substance, but of course this had a nuclear fusion core, and whereas the Mark II had enough reactive material for 12 years in the nuclear plant, this one upped that to 20, so it didn't need to be refueled, but its reaction mass coming out the back would have to be topped off every time. But it did have expanded abilities. It could accelerate at 1G for 60 plus hours. At 6 to 7G, you had roughly an hour's acceleration. And now we have a new top speed or top acceleration, I should say, of 9Gs. But if you put the pedal to the metal, it can only do this for about 15 or so minutes. But it's there if needed. And it carries 6 days. As I was saying before the Colonial delivery service knocked, it had 6 days of supplies for the pilot, just in case. And talking of the pilot, he had a much better appointed cockpit. For one, it was a frameless design, unlike the Mark II and III, giving better field of view. His instruments were entirely electronic, or at least 90% plus so. There was digital displays, heads up, much more automation for battlefield awareness, sit, rep. better targeting for the weapons. It had an improved sensor suite to work with the new central computer, which was much more powerful. A lot of the sensor equipment was in the nose. Originally, the computer would not be networked, but it actually would have the ability for networking in the future. Of course, firewalls were in place. But what about the offensive capability? Sensors and computers and displays are great, but a Viper is an offensive craft. It's a weapon. So what did the Mark 7 bring to the table? Well, previous production Vipers, like the Mark II and Mark III, had 2 cannon. But first pioneered on the Mark VI that never went into production, the Mark 7 mounted 3 cannon. These were Mech A12 autocannon, 30 millimeters, each with 1,000 rounds. Remember, the Mark II had 800 rounds per cannon, the Mark III had 1,000. So we're going from 1,600 to 2,000 to 3,000 rounds on board. But whereas the Mark II focused on its guns and the Mark III focused on its ordnance, the Mark 7 would combine them. Again, it's a multi-role craft, and it too would be designed for guided missile use. It had 1 internal weapons bay and 1 external hardpoint under each of the 2 horizontal wings. So a total of 3. It could carry 1 long-range anti-shipping missile in the internal bay, conventional or nuclear, or it could carry 4 medium or short-range missiles in the bay. Under each external hardpoint, you have pretty much the same. You can carry 1 long range, 2 medium range, or up to 4 short range. These would be the next generation of Javelin missile. Plus, it carried chaff and flare for defense. And it had a good top speed, around 380 meters per second acceleration, so about the same as the Mark II, and it could have been faster, but they decided to put that into agility maneuverability. So even though it was larger than the Mark II, it actually was just as agile. Again, the new thrust vectoring engine system, and just the new engines in general, the efficiency helped, and the computer control in the cockpit allowed the pilot more of a fly-by-wire as opposed to straight conventional use as on the Mark II with more traditional gauges and what have you. And these could operate from standard Battlestars, and they required somewhat refitting, but since they weren't as large as the Mark III, they weren't as intensive for that. This was introduced roughly 25 years after the Cylon War, and unlike the Mark IV, V, and VI, this was put into mass production and was designed to really just fulfill all the fleet needs, working in conjunction with the latest variants of the Raptor. But with the new Viper, what about capital ships? Only a few Artemis classes survived the war, and these would either be decommissioned or put in the reserve fleet. Maybe a couple put on planetary duty, training duty. That left the surviving Jupiters to be the large scale. Most of your Orions would be retired out, but your Loki cruisers would still make up the supply part of the fleet. But it actually was the Valkyrie class that really carried the fleet. It was intended for mass production and to be very flexible, and really its only shortcoming of being lightly armored wasn't a hindrance in a peacetime. they were able to make groups based around 2 to 3 of these, and that was perfect for planetary defense. In fact, most of the colonies would have 2 to 3 stationed in orbit above them at any given time. After the war, Valkyrie herself would go on several missions, but eventually wind up as part of the Caprica Defense Fleet 40 years after. Yeah, the Valkyries really proved to be a great peacetime battlestar. They made the politicians happy. They were easy to maintain, did not require a huge crew. In fact, during peacetime, their crews were reduced to around 1,250 from a high point of 1,750 during the war. Some of this had to do with automation. Some of it had to do with just not needing every gun battery and Viper tube manned. And they were routinely updated. Valkyrie herself went through several refits and modernizations, and they continued to produce them pretty much unchanged for decades. Improvements here and there, but it's still basically the same ship. And they would make the bulk of the Colonial fleet. But the Jupiter was aging. It was a design roughly 10 years older than the Valkyrie, and it was starting to really show it a couple of decades after the end of the war. And while the Valkyrie was great as a support battlestar, a tactical battlestar, there was still very much a need for a command ship, a flagship, really just something to show the might and power and be a central location to coordinate activities. Thus, first put into field testing 20 years after the armistice, I bring to you the Mercury class heavy battlestar. This was quite a leap forward, really mirroring what the Mark VII did, and in some ways developed in concert with the new Viper. And there would be really 3 production blocks. Block 0 was more of the testing prototype, and there was only a handful of these. It was really there to test the new flight pods. Whereas the Jupiter type had retractable pods, the Mercury would go back to fixed flight pods, like seen on the Artemis and Valkyrie types. The retractable pods was a good experiment, but the benefits really just weren't there compared to the added complexity and time required. But unlike the Valkyrie, the Mercury had double flight pods, one on top of another, giving a total of not 2 but 4 flight decks, and the ability to launch and house and resupply twice as many Vipers, while really not taking up all that much more space. But she was definitely a big beast. After testing with the Block Zeros, about 25 years after the armistice, the Block 1, which was the full production model of Mercury class, went into service, and that would be what the Pegasus herself started off as. This would have the flight pods we just talked about. It would have more advanced computer systems, automation, all the bells and whistles. And then roughly 35 years after the armistice, the final production version, the Block 2, would be introduced. This would have further advancements in automation, reclamation, and computer systems, as well as compatibility with the latest weaponry and guidance systems and command protocols. And older Block 1s could be updated to the new standard just as with the Jupiter before, went from the Mark I to the Mark II during the war. And speaking of the Jupiter, of course they beg comparison because the Mercury was adopted as its direct replacement as a flagship, a command ship, a central piece in a battle group. The Mercury was 1,790 meters long and was 730 meters wide and about 330 meters tall at its highest point. Compare this to the Jupiter class, which was 1,445 long and 540 wide with pods extended fully and 360 with pods retracted fully. So, as you can tell, the Mercury had a lot more volume. But it had a smaller crew. The Jupiter had a full crew of 5,000 during the war. A lot of these were there to man the guns, but also service the large contingent of Vipers. Well, the Mercury certainly had its contingent of Vipers, we'll get to that in just a minute, and it certainly had its large guns, but many of them were remote controlled, even automated, computerized fire. The Jupiter had a full crew of 5,000. The Mercury had a full crew of 2,500. That's because it was a smarter, more automated vessel. It just didn't need as many more people. In fact, it could function with as few as 1,700, and even fewer as a skeleton crew if you didn't need full functionality. It really was a peacetime vessel, but also meant to support admirals and other flag officers, so it had plenty of room for their contingent or Marines. And of course, weapons were just as important. The Jupiter had 40 primary weapons gun batteries, plus roughly 800 small point defense batteries and 12 missile silos. The Mercury was a little different again. It had 34 primary weapons batteries, so that sounds smaller, but for one, they were all dual emplacements, and for another, they were multi-purpose, like with the Valkyrie, so kinetic weapons and missiles. Now, of these, 4 were fixed mount long-range artillery, and 30 were fully turreted. And on top of that, it had over 1,000 smaller missile and gun emplacement points for point defense, anti-missile, anti-fighter. And if a missile did get through, it was armored and shielded against a thermonuclear warhead. Whereas a Jupiter might be able to take a hit from a nuke, it would get damaged, and radiation would be a problem. With the Mercury, this was lessened considerably. In addition, we had a total of 8 primary sublight engines, as opposed to 4 plus 2 auxiliary on the Jupiter. We had a more advanced FTL drive system with navigation computer. Command and control as usual. And the flight pods, the Vipers. At full strength, the Jupiter could support up to 80 Viper Mark IIs, or 3s later on in the war, plus a contingent of up to 20 Raptors or shuttles. The Mercury, because of its 4 flight decks and pods and all that, could support 160 Vipers, and it was designed from the outset for the Mark VII, plus 40 more in reserve. As for its Raptors/shuttle complement, it could easily support 50. So double or more than the previous Jupiter. And if that's not enough, it had a full manufacturing facility for Viper Mark 7s. Essentially, it could take in raw materials, ores, and other mined things, and at the other end spit out a Mark 7. So it could resupply. Now, was it the fastest production in the world? No, not as fast as a full factory, but it was on board. This also meant it could very easily repair its Vipers. In addition, it had very advanced training facilities for pilots, virtual reality type systems, whereas the old Jupiter had much more mechanical training and practice systems. And it had much more advanced water and air reclamation facilities. Now, the Jupiter did have those, but it wasn't as efficient. This was. In fact, it could operate for 5 years without a major resupply, and longer in a pinch. It even had some food reclamation and growing facilities on board. It was simply much more self-sufficient, and this would let it supply other members of its Battlestar group, not just itself, being a central hub. The Jupiter would also act in this role, but to a lesser extent. Of course, it had more advanced DRADIS and other sensors, more automation for even things like doors, better crew quarters. Again, it's a larger ship, but a smaller crew. Now, part of the size is taken up by the manufacturing facilities and all that, but it still left more for the crew, making it more of a plum assignment. In Jupiter, we've got a wartime vessel designed with wartime constraints, lowest bidder. With the Mercury, as we saw with the Pegasus, this was put in service to really show the technological advancement of the 12 colonies, and would become the backbone of the fleet. So with the Mercury class being the flagship, the center point, and the Valkyrie class kind of being the jack of all trades, Battlestar or heavy cruiser, what about the dozens of Jupiter classes that survived the war? Well, they would be refit years after the war into battle cruisers away from battleships. And they did this by stripping armor off to improve speed, acceleration. They would also reduce its primary guns from 40 to 24, and its point defense emplacements from roughly 800 down to just over 500. And her Viper complement would routinely be shifted down to roughly 40, with roughly 10 Raptors or shuttles on board. So just, downgrading a bit. But this did give better maneuverability, speed, agility, and resource recycling for other purposes. They would not make new Jupiters, but the ones that were there would keep being used. And because of the peacetime and the reduction in gun emplacements and everything, her standard crew would reduce from 5,000 to 3,500, including Viper and other flight deck personnel. Still more than a Mercury class, but more efficient all in all. And these would kind of be venerable old ships in the fleet, and the ones that survived would be phased out or turned into experimental/training carriers. For example, the Columbia would actually be the ship used to test the Mark 7 Viper. And when it went into service, the existing Jupiters would have their facilities updated to work with the newer Vipers, and for that matter, Raptors. But of course, they could still support the older Mark IIs and Mark IIIs if needs be. But those were long out of service 20, 30, 40 years after the armistice. And at the end, only the Galactica assigned to Caprica would remain as the only active Jupiter class. A couple more would be in the mothball, the reserve fleet, but they were all but decommissioned. The rest were, after being used as training carriers, eventually scrapped. They were a relic of a bygone era, as it were. And as more and more Mercuries came online, they were simply not efficient and economical to keep operating. So the last Jupiter-class Battlestar was slated to be transformed into a museum ship to celebrate, acknowledge, and memorialize this 12-year Cylon War. And finally, we come to the disposition, the status, the strength of the Colonial fleet 40 years after the armistice. It existed with roughly 120 Battlestars and their supporting vessels. The bulk were Valkyrie classes. A handful of Jupiters could still be counted among them, and a somewhat larger but still relatively small number of Mercury classes. There would still be tenders like the Loki, and other support ships like the Berserk and Defender classes, and several civilian ships used for military purposes. They would be supported primarily by the Mark VII Viper, with the older Mark IIs and 3s out of service, and of course the updated variants of the Raptors. Still very much in use and updated, old but useful, as both an ECM and an assault variant, and plenty Colonial shuttles, Mark I and Mark II, now with FTL drives, were available. And they would protect the colonies, shipping lanes, civilian commerce, and monitor the border with the Cylons, which had been quiet for many yarns. And that would be it. With the war becoming a distant memory, with a whole generation growing up after it, computerization, even networking was coming back into fashion. And what could happen bad there? The fleet of the 12 colonies of Cobol. And with that, we come to the second half of the video, where I talk about the real world models, ships, and designs, and my impressions of these from eaglemoss themselves, just for fun, hanging out. So let's dive into it. Just as iconic as the Battlestars themselves, the Vipers. So let's begin here with the Mark I. This came, I forget exactly where in the series, but it was relatively early, in the first half dozen or so. As you can tell, these are quite large scale, based on the cockpit. Of course, this is the classic original series, and in that it would have had laser guns, turbo lasers, energy missiles. But one thing I really liked about the reimagined, they kept pretty much all the original designs, if not front and foremost, at least in the show. Like, we see one of these hanging in first, I believe, the hangar, and then later the bar on Galactica, meaning that this happened in universe for them. And we might actually see them flying around once or twice in a flashback scene, but the lasers are replaced by cannon. and it fits in very well. As a pre-war design, a little sleeker, a little more electronic. The eaglemoss itself is quite nice. Setting the trend, we have a metal fuselage, plastic wings, and part of the underside's metal, part's plastic. We do have a translucent canopy. Not a lot of detail inside, but then again, the original studio model didn't have a lot going on too, at least the one used in the space scenes. No, it's a really substantial size. I don't actually know which scale. They don't really do scales, but I would say roughly it's close to 148. Certainly larger than 172. It's got some good weight to it. It is decidedly die-cast. And I actually really like the stand it comes with these little pegs that stick in behind the cannon, or laser guns. It actually fits on very well and isn't prone to coming off. Plus, it gives a little extra support behind the guns if they were to get knocked. Not perfect, but not bad. So this was a good start here for the Mark 1. While I can't remember exactly when the Mark 1 was released in the collection, the Mark 2 was the first ship in the fleet. And they did a few versions. They did Starbucks, they did Huskers, and they did alternative clean Starbuck. It doesn't quite fit in the stand as well, but it's okay. Once you get it in there, just make sure it's kind of couched in properly. There's a bit of a curve on the underside, and if you get the stand lined up properly, because it's kind of pinched itself, it'll fit in fine. Just be mindful of that. Another reason is this is heavy, heavier than the Mark 1. We have metal wings. The top wing is plastic, the short one. The body, the fuselage, is almost all metal with just a little bit of plastic on the bottom in this area here, but it's mostly metal. This has a very World War II look, especially to the canopy, with the framing and very square, flat panels. Kind of a Spitfire, something to it. Got the two guns. I like the engine intake detail. The sides here remind me very much of an X-Wing. But then in the back is definitely Viper. Then again, the original Viper was definitely inspired on some level by the X-Wing. No bones about that, but that's okay. Everything's inspired by something. But no, this is a very good first offering. Very large canopy. This is almost 1/32 scale. It's certainly at least 1/48. But it's very chunky, very heavy. Let's see if I can get it on here right again. So I had it in there pretty good before. See, it kind of likes to slide around, but there's a sweet spot about right there in the middle. And it's on there pretty good. That's actually the stem wobbling, not the ship on the stand. These are both classics. But I'm going to be honest, and this changes day to day, but right now, the way I'm feeling, I actually like our next two Vipers more. Not in terms of what they did, but just in terms of how they look. The Mark III, the latest Viper in the series, and the last one we got in the collection. This was, of course, from Blood and Chrome, which took place towards the end of the Cylon War. Not the very end when we see the Razor flashbacks, but about 2 years before the end. And this is the largest Viper. It's also the largest model in our collection. The canopy is an interesting blend of old and new. That was kind of the design aesthetic of Blood and Chrome, was old and new. It's got the intake. This is all metal. Got your guns. Plastic wings, but I don't blame them for that because of how thin they are. Got these smaller engines in the back, and then you flip it over. Trying to do it carefully. And you've got bays and gear on the underside. This up front's all metal. Plastic in the middle here. But it is very solid. It's very solid. It's the heaviest of all of them. And I think because it was a later CGI, they were able to give a little more detail. And like I said, in Universe, it's meant to be a multi-role fighter rather than a space superiority, so it is the beefiest one. But yeah, this definitely looks like something that would carry missiles. Kind of the equivalent of a Typhoon or a Tempest or a P-47 in World War II terms. But it does look a little more modern than the Mark II. I like that. And finally, the Mark VII. As far as I know at this point, the Mark IV, 5, and 6 were never seen on screen in any show. I think they might have been in a video game or two, but yeah. This is essentially the F-16 of the Battlestar Galactica world, and that's one reason it has this very bubbly, frameless canopy. Very angular body. It's deceptively slim. It looks smaller than it really is, both the model and the craft itself. It's very sleek, but it's actually still quite very long. And thanks to the top tail or top fin, it does stick up quite a bit. Interesting that it does have its guns spread out a little more. And it has 3 instead of 2. This one is, of course, Apollo's. In the show, you see Mark IIs and Mark VIIs in the beginning, but most Mark VIIs are lost. Galactica recovers 6 or 7. They have their CNPs taken out, deactivated. And then, of course, when the Pegasus comes, we see more. There's actually a couple of different CGI models used in the show. So if eaglemoss had ever gone crazy with the collection, they could have done both variants. But I don't really believe in Universe they're supposed to be different, just, different CGI. As far as this one, it's actually the lightest of them, even though the wing is metal. Fuselage is metal. But it's just a slimmer design. But about the same scale. Looking at the cockpit again. I remember when this one came in the mail in the morning right before Jay and I were going to go shooting. It kind of was exciting. I was looking forward to the Mark VII, the modern Viper. I think it's kind of a love it or hate it thing. But I like the design. Whereas the Mark II is very much World War II era. This is very much a modern day looking spacecraft / aircraft, including having the thrust vectoring and whatnot. The other thing about it, when I got it, it did surprise me how light it was. Not bad in any way, just, it is lighter. This came out pretty early in the collection too, right after the Mark I and Mark II. It fits its stand pretty well. but I still think the Mark 1 fits the best. In terms of the show, it's hard to say the Mark II isn't the most important. Of course, traditional fans will prefer the Mark 1, but I, by and large, like the reimagined. I like the original, but I'm going to be honest, I thought it had too of a happy-go-lucky tone for a bunch of people that just lost 99% of their species. I think today, sometimes shows get dark. And when you think of Battlestar Galactica, the reimagined series, you do think dark, but there's actually a lot of levity and camaraderie in it. For example, the episode Hand of God. I think they knew when to throw in a happy or a distractive episode. It wasn't just all the time. Anyway, as far as design, I kind of like the Mark III. The Mark 7's neat. The Mark II is probably the highest quality model. Certainly the one with the heaviest metal. So, they're very much from the same lineage. And I like that. I like the kind of continuous nature of things. But what about you? What's your favorite Viper? Next, let's talk support craft, and we'll talk the Colonial shuttle. This was actually the second to the last one released in the collection. Seen quite a bit in the original series, and seen more than a few times in the reimagined, both in the pilot episode, the miniseries where Boxy's father, as it happened, went to Armistice Station. It's also seen a few times here and there. It's a classic space shuttle. It's a box with engines. It's fine, though. You know, it's kind of like the Star Trek shuttles. They had to keep them pretty simple so they could have miniatures and full sizes that looked reasonably the same for actors to interact with, so not exactly aerodynamic. What I will say, though, is this is heavy. Metal. Sticky out bits are plastic, engines are plastic, and part of your bottom is plastic, but other parts metal. So it's a chunky one. And there's actually quite a bit of little greebly stuff going on. Sensors, antenna. Unlike a Star Trek shuttle, which is always sleek, this looks more Star Warsy. You know, this is one of those things, it should sit on the stand well. And it does, except if it slides in backwards, it becomes back heavy and then tips back. Unfortunately, I never really found a better way to put it on. So when I put it on, I just make sure it's pushed all the way forward, and as long as it doesn't get pushed from the front, it's fine. Maybe there's another way to put it on that I haven't figured out yet. But yeah, that's too front heavy, and that's too front heavy. You gotta have these thrusters here. You've gotta accommodate with those. So it's kind of like with the Mark II Viper. That is something worth pointing out. In the original series, the shuttle was not FTO capable, and they reimagined it was. And there was actually a smaller shuttle they used as well. But yeah, it's a shuttle. I like it just fine. In the original show, it also carried at least one land ram in the back, or a bunch of Marines. It's a flying brick, what can I say? Of course, our next ship isn't a whole lot better. Partially replacing the shuttle for some duties, and unique to the reimagined, never in the original, the Raptor. And I gotta admit, this one, I didn't know what to expect, what it would look like. And there's a few elements that didn't shock me, like the small wings and the kind of bubble canopy. But overall, it's not exactly, it's more like stocky and bulky and blocky than I expected, if I'm being honest. The underside here, where the hatch would have been, the VTOL or V-stall thrusters, plastic on the underside, metal partial of the wings, metal body. This is actually one of the lightest ones in the collection, partially again just based on its size and just all the kind of greebly details that it has. This is boomers, so it's in more of the transport and ECO role, electronic warfare. Not really armed up with anything. I think this was issue 10 in the collection, so not quite halfway, but close. Big engines in the back. It sits on its stand reasonably well. There's kind of a spot that the stand conforms to once it's in there. Not really much to hold it on, but it sits fine. But the other one's a lot more interesting. The so-called Heavy Raptor, the Assault Raptor. This is where kind of the limitations of eaglemoss are known. It would have been much cooler to get the Raptor in a kit and just be able to attach or detach different pods, guns, ordnance. But that's just not how eaglemoss does their stuff. Never did. So this is the only time I kind of felt like they were slightly lazy, because it's essentially the same model, just with all the stuff under the wings and on the fuselage. That said, they did a really good job with it. This is kind of featured from the New Caprica scene and a few others where they just arm the Raptors to the teeth and go at it. It is heavier for obvious reasons. Most of the new bits are plastic, but it does feel like there's a little bit more metal in this one. Maybe the wings, just to support. I don't know. I do like the kind of gun belts running into the guns. It said that the Raptor was actually inspired by the Apache helicopter, and maybe, but being a two-seater and a multi-role, to me it's more inspired by the Hind, the Mill Mi-24, because it can carry. I am glad we got this one. I just, yeah, kind of almost feels like having two Raptors so similar, just different ordnance, was a bit of a waste in a only 25-piece collection. And I really wish we had gotten one of the Cylon War variants with the turret in the rear, the so-called Toaster Slayer gun. That would have been cool. But we got what we got. If you only got one, I would definitely get the Heavy Raptor. It's more interesting. But if you're a big Boomer fan, then you might want the first one. But yeah, there's not a whole lot of difference in the actual core model itself, as you would imagine. Well, the first and really only government ship we got, Colonial 1, but this started off as just kind of a standard starliner, essentially equivalent to like a Boeing 747 in space. In Battlestar lore, these were in service before the Cylon War, and of course served after. Just a good, dependable spacecraft. I've still often thought it would look cooler this way. I don't know why, but it isn't. Got the big fins in the back. Be cool if the parts moved, but again, just not something eaglemoss did. It's actually quite long, thin. This is metal with part of the top plastic. Metal. It's a neat design. It really is. And it definitely has kind of a ship, freighter, and space thing going on. Unfortunately, we didn't really get much of the civilian fleet. And by and large, I can't blame them. But Colonial 1 was so important that kind of had to have it. And the stand it has is quite interesting the way it works. It actually slots in with the rear engine. Very sturdy, honestly, for what it is. And I could see this one being a little challenging to get on a stand, but they pulled it off. And here we have the final member in the collection, at least as of now. I don't think Master Replicas is going to do these again. I kind of feel like the collection was at a natural end, unfortunately. The big ships have been done. It's a little interesting that they picked the Astral Queen, a former passenger liner. On the other hand, this was featured in the original series as just, quote, the prison barge. So it's always good when they give us a ship that was in both. This is very long. It may be the longest. It's actually very thin too, and somewhat light. I mean, not super light. This is all metal. Part of the side's plastic, part of the bottom. A lot of detail though. It did, of course, play a role with Tom Zerk and all that. Maybe they did it because they wanted to give the competition to Colonial 1. But I'm still kind of surprised they didn't do like Cloud 9 or the Demetrius. There's a few other civilian ships that were as important. And for all I know, they were planning on it, but the collection was ended beforehand. A lot going on with this ship, kind of more than one would think. Engine bells. Could almost pass as a Starfleet ship with the saucer and everything. I'm not going to say they ended the collection on an extremely high note, but they could have done a lot worse. It's an impressive model. Kind of doing what eaglemoss does best. This is really something that only they would do. Most of your other Battlestar Galactica collections in the past just focused on Vipers, the Battlestar, a Cylon Raider or two, and that was it. No one really thought to do, the prison ship. So that was cool. And it is a neat design. It really is. The stand is okay. Not the best, not the worst. Kind of just has a spot it fits into, and once you get it, it's there. Kind of has an interesting downward angle, unless I have it on reversed. It's always possible with me. That's how it goes. Oops, almost did that. That would have been bad. Little thing there. I've often debated what's really the top on this. Always has confused me a little bit, but I think I had it right. Maybe I didn't. It's a very flippy ship. That could be the top, but just doesn't seem to sit as well. It sits very low either way. It's very low. It's a low rider. No, but I really do wish we could have had more of the civilian fleet. Yeah, that seems to be how that stand's meant to go. Just an interesting angle. But again, I understand why they wouldn't want to do it in the full scale. I'm telling you, a pack would have been cool. Oh, well. But let's get back to military things. That's what you're here for, I know. Really, it's difficult to argue if the Viper or the Galactica herself is the most iconic ship. But they're certainly in the runnings. And the TOS Galactica that eaglemoss gave us is damn impressive. Again, I'm happy that this reappeared in the Reimagined series. It was unnamed in a few scenes and whatnot, but games, including Deadlock, call it the Artemis class, and that works for me. It's nice to see it in the universe. Of course, just as with the Viper Mark I, the lasers have been replaced by kinetic energy guns. Even though that's pretty common in sci-fi today, when the Reimagine was created in 2003, most sci-fi was lasers, phasers, plasma guns, doing essentially modern propellant kinetic guns was pretty advanced in an interesting retro way. Thinking back, Stargate was one of the others that kind of did that. Of course, today with the Expanse and many others, it doesn't seem like that, but it was a breath of fresh air and kind of gave that realism to the World War II in space vibe. And of course, the original ship had an energy shield, and its version of going to FTL was just going faster. Pretty standard. But of course, with the Reimagined, they had more of a jump point system, which, has its merits. In some ways may be more scientifically plausible, but then again, since we don't have faster than light, it's really impossible to say which one's realistic until we discover it. By the way, I find it silly, some people that say we'll never be able to go faster than light. Maybe not directly, like, oh, just go faster, but I really believe we'll find a workaround or something. Too many times things have been said they couldn't be done, and then they're done, so, yeah. Anywho. Very impressive ship. Very heavy metal. Flight pods are plastic. Part of the engine block is metal, part's plastic. But it's probably the heaviest Battlestar. At least one of the heaviest for sure. Very flat design though. Lots of little greeblies on it. As is famously known, some of them were just abstract things, model train parts and the like. But it was the original. Kind of like the flattened flight pods. And the big old block in the back. No, it's a very impressive model. Just about the right size to sit on your desk and not be ostentatious, but also big enough for all the detail you might want. I think if eaglemoss had only done Battlestars, the collection still would have been successful. Because that's what most, folks were here for being honest. Everything else was just gravy. Number 3 in the collection, and the first capital ship we got, was of course the reimagined Battlestar. Now interestingly, there's debate for years on what the class name was. But today, Jupiter really seems to be what's settled upon. Although I don't know if that's technically canon. Although I think these days Deadlock is more or less considered canon. Either way, I like it. It fits this big style very well. Now I will say, when I first got this, size-wise, it's quite good. But it surprised me how light it is. Compared to the Viper Mark II and the Cylon Raider, the two we'd had before it, this was significantly lighter. And the real reason is, it's the detail. You can't do a lot of this in metal, so it has to be plastic. Now that said, it's not paper. It's not lightweight. It does have kind of metal in the spine and main body, and the head is metal. But by necessity, to give it the detailing, the engines, the flight pods are all plastic. Again, in a perfect world, it would be neat if the flight pods would retract. But that's just not how eaglemoss does their things. That's up to a different maker who wants to do it. But other than that, no real complaints. Notice the ribbing, the exposed kind of spine of the ship, the bones of it, if you were, and that there, the bucket, or if you want to be more respectful, the grand old lady. This one really surprised me when I got it in my hands, because I just really didn't know what it looked like. And really, if you think about it, it's a pretty different look from the original Battlestar. But it's still identifiably so. It's its own thing. But still familiar somehow. And you know how I criticized them for doing 2 Raptors and kind of felt like that was a wasted space? Well, now I'm about to contradict myself. Coming out towards the end of the collection, the Blood and Chrome, the Cylon War variant of Galactica. Again, this is pretty much the same, especially on the underside. A few more guns in the middle. Little less exposed ribbing, but really the difference is all on the top side. The ribbing is covered up by armor, and we have just a lot of guns. A lot of guns. If I wasn't such a big fan of Battlestars in general, like the class, maybe I'd be like, eh. But I can't help but be happy they gave us the grand old lady back in her prime, when she was a warship to really not be trifled with. Good God, the guns. Like I said, 40 primary installations, 800 or so secondary. They even had larger Viper stacks and the pods. It's not really much heavier or larger, but it does come with an improved stand. It actually has little notches that kind of slot into one of the spines, so it doesn't really want to walk off its stand as much. You can tell they improved it a bit. The original was fine. This is better. It's a little more secure, so I like it for being that. Let's see how it sits this way. It's got a little bit of an angle to it. It's a little more straight. Either way, you can kind of position these a little bit, but they're secure. I think the idea with the stands is they didn't want them to be obtrusive. They want them to look like they're just kind of floating there on your shelf. It's a decent illusion for what it is. Which Galactica do you like better? And actually, that is very true to real life. A lot of times, older battleships would have some armor stripped off and some guns taken off and be turned into fast battleships or fast battle cruisers between World War I and World War II. So it's very true to life for a ship to actually lose guns and armor as time goes on. Also, when it's put into the training or reserve fleet. Kind of interesting. Next up, just because it was kind of next to hand, let's talk about the Osiris, sometimes called the Orion class pocket battlestar. It's also been said this is based on the catamaran style. What an interesting little ship, with lots of antennae sticking out and a very prominent flight deck type thing on the side there, really belying its size or lack thereof if your flight deck is that much of your ship. But I'm happy to get more from Blood and Chrome. I'm not happy that Blood and Chrome didn't take off. I think there was potential there, more than with Caprica. Didn't really get that. Caprica was little, not my speed, but Blood and Chrome had potential, but who knows what it would have turned out like. Interesting little Battlestar, though. Again, lots of gribbly bobblies going on. And you can definitely see a scout ship like this. No real armor, lots of control. Flying in. You can see the ribs on the underside. Again, kind of showing just how large or how small of a ship it is, how large the ribs are, because they'd be about the same size on the Galactica. For what it is, it's got a decent amount of weight. This is all metal, with all the sticky outy bits being plastic, which they kind of have to be, really. You really like the split alligator head design. It's a little derpy looking, but in kind of a cool way. Yeah, there's such a thing as derpy cool. I'm telling you right now. Again, I'm gonna be a happy camper with any Battlestars or even cruisers they give us. And it sits on the stand fine. I can't imagine developing a stand for this was the easiest, but it's secure. Has a little bit of movement, but nothing too bad. I like to set it in the front like that, so it's not, because it's a little front heavy with the metal. But no, I like it. I mean, this should definitely not be a hero ship, but it's a great support ship in a fleet, in my opinion. And you can really tell the more detail put into the CGI models for Blood and Chrome, because it came out over a decade after the original series. Next up, the Loki or Loki supply ship, the heavy cruiser. And maybe it's a little funny, but this is big. Like, the model is big. One of the biggest, certainly the longest. It's not the heaviest. Your cargo is your metal, with this being metal, and then these nacelles being plastic, and their supports, as you'd expect. It's pretty standard. It's not light, it's not flimsy. It's well built for what it is. Again, I'm glad we got a support ship. If you see my Star Trek videos, you know I like the background ships, the freighters, the tankers. We need them. In fact, the only thing that I don't like about the Loki is it makes me want more. It makes me want the Defender, the Celestra, the Berserk. I like support ships. They're neat. And they usually have just weird, unique, innovative designs to them as well. You know, when they do a Battlestar, they've got to make it fit in. But when they do a secondary background ship, one or two designers can just pretty much go hog wild. And as long as there's something against the general design aesthetic or whatnot, it usually makes it in. I love all the engines in the back, really showing the thrust required to keep this thing at speed, the redundancy. And your fleet would definitely have to have a ship like this. And then we have a large flight deck. Again, exactly what you need. And then just a few guns on the head, because this is a warship, even if they're only there for defense. But if you're in the collection, don't overlook this one. They did a really good job for what it is. And again, it adds to the Ghost fleet from Blood and Chrome. I think there's at least 2 of them there. As we near the end, let's talk about a favorite, both in the universe and with fans. The Valkyrie, which I believe now has been confirmed as the Valkyrie class. Originally, Woden, or Odin, was sometimes said as the name. The Valkyrie was actually Adama's command before the Galactica, back during the Stealth Star incident. These were definitely in service at the end of the war, because we see some in the Ghost fleet and towards the end, but they were very, very new at the time. And yeah, per square foot, square meter, since we've been doing meters throughout the video, this has so many guns on it. But the flip side is this light, soft, creamy underbelly, complete with exposed FTL spools right there. And it has a casing around them. It's not directly into space, but that's not going to take much. Maybe it could repulse some cannon fire, but any missile hit's going to knock that thing out. But the flip side is this thing is very maneuverable, and if it rolls over and presents its dorsal to you, you're screwed. Plus, with all the Sea-Wiz batteries on it, chances are it's going to shoot down any missile coming in. And they could build a lot of these, and they weren't terribly, intensive on the crew. This vessel was a little slow to make it into Battlestar Galactica, but once it was there, it just kind of appeared like for example, it was in the plan several times. It was there might have been one at Scorpia shipyards, I can't remember, and Razor, and it was definitely in that season 3 episode with the Valkyrie herself. But it was cool to see another Battlestar, and a pretty different looking one. It's very much a Battlestar, but yeah, it has a very different design aesthetic, and the way the Viper tubes work on this is actually different. And so when eaglemoss announced they were doing this, I think everyone was super excited and anticipatory. And I don't think anyone was disappointed. They did a really good job. It's got all the spiky bits. It's very flat, like the original Artemis type. It has the much kind of newer looking engines in the rear. And while I wouldn't want to be hit on the underbelly, I think having the exposed everything is actually pretty neat. And this is all metal for the most part. Since it's so flat, they're able to make this just kind of a continuous piece of metal until you get to the flight pods. Even part of the engines are metal. And I'm glad, I mean, it's a good size, but I'm glad they didn't make it huge, because no way was it going to be in scale with Galactica. But it would have looked ridiculous if, when you set Galactica on the shelf with this, the Valkyrie was bigger. So I'm happy to report they did not do that. I'm trying to find, there's a little spot for the stand. It kind of goes around that spool there. There we go. It actually fits its stand pretty good. But let's end with the fan favorite, the Beast. Ironically, this class was named the Mercury from kind of the get-go. And the whole storyline with Admiral Kane and the Pegasus herself was taken from the original series. But in the original series, Kane was a commander just like Adama, and the Pegasus was the same type as Galactica. So to give Kane a higher rank and a much more powerful modern ship than Adama, you know, a lot of people criticize it for the fight between them. But I think what sometimes is overlooked is, in the end, both of them decided to stand down. It wasn't like one of them did attempt to assassinate the other. It was on the paper. But again, these are people that lost their entire way of life, their entire civilization. And in the case of Kane, many hundreds of her crew were killed. Not to mention her lover betrayed her. It's going to drive anyone crazy. Everyone went through their own things. So I think it was very believable. But I did like how at the end they both voluntarily stood their assassins down. If one of them had attempted on the other, that would have pushed it over the edge. Like I said earlier, this series was really good about being dark, but also knowing when to let hope and humanity shine through. Just enough. As for the ship, it's just cool. And in a lot of ways, this was inspired more by the original Battlestar. You can really see it with the fat head and just the pods, the flatter pods. It's still very different, of course, but it does have the 3 connecting pylons. And it's massive. Now, it's not in scale with the others. That would be ridiculous. But you put it on the shelf, much like the Valkyrie conveys the fact that it's a smaller ship than the Jupiter. This conveys that it's a larger ship than the Jupiter. In a perfect world, it would have been neat to have them all on scale, but that's not what eaglemoss does. They do things to a size. These were all basically 8 to 11 or 12 inches. And this one is very heavy, too. It's probably our heaviest Battlestar. Maybe the original Galactica is heavier, but it's close. Metal. Metal. And part of the flight pod might be metal too, even if it's like kind of a metal core. Engines are plastic. Yeah. This is a Battlestar. Or rather, heavy Battlestar. And we see it take a pounding in the show. Heck, it took a pounding as when it escaped the Scorpio shipyards. Not unscathed. Galactica got off lightly in comparison. And Then, of course, after Cain, this would eventually end up in the hands of Apollo. I hate to call him a Nepo baby, but Nepo a little bit. Then again, it's kind of funny that his father kept his old clunky, smaller, less effective ship and gave his son the more powerful ship. So I guess it does show trust in your son, because if he wanted to do a coup, there wouldn't be any stopping the Pegasus. I mean, it can make its own Vipers. So, yeah. And it had full training facilities for the crew. What a neat ship. They're all neat, though. And here they are lined up. I didn't put the Osiris or the Loki in. I'm very grateful to have them, but they're support ships. These are the Battlestars, ranging with the Valkyrie at the smallest at about 650 meters, then the Artemis, the original, at just over 1,000, and then our two Jupiters, both of course at a little under 1,500, and our Mercury at a little under 1,800. So the Mercury was definitely bigger, longer I should say, than the Jupiter, but it really came in its bulk. It's a thicker design. So which do you like the best? I would have a hard time picking. As far as the quality of the models, I think the Pegasus is really impressive, even though it's not much longer than the others. It just has heft to it. But the classic one, maybe because I just didn't expect as much out of it, when I unboxed it, I thought, wow, this is cool. And it or the Pegasus are the heaviest. But I think they did a very great job with the Valkyrie, and they didn't do a slouch with the Galactica, and it gets points because we have both variants. Of the two, even though I know this is the original, we're supposed to always like the originals, but I gotta go with the blood and chrome. The guns, the extra armor, the better stand for the model, I do like it more. But otherwise, I'd really have a hard time picking. But if you made me, I'd probably have to go with the Mercury. In-universe is just too cool. And it's a really neat design. And I like how it does build upon the original, but modernizes it and gives it more detail. But, you know, hey. These are all the Battlestars we see in the show. I know there's a few more in Deadlock. Maybe it would have been cool if the collection had continued on long enough to do some ships from Deadlock, just like how they did the Star Trek Online collection. But typically ships from video games don't sell especially well, especially not in this larger scale. But I think these were good sellers for eaglemoss. I got into the collection quite early. I think when I got in, they had just released the original Battlestar, the Jupiter, so issue 3. But actually, the first one I got in was the Raider. But then the Battlestar and the Viper Mark II came very short time later, and so I was up to date when issue 4 came out, which I believe was the TOS base star. Could be wrong on that, but yeah, I got that one right as it came out. In fact, this ship and the base star were really the earliest video I did for this personal channel. At least one of the very earliest. Probably the first model video. So in a lot of ways, it's just special to me. Kind of remember when these came in, and I was really impressed with the size and the weight of them. And the day that the Pegasus came in. And then I was disappointed because one of the engines was loose in the box. Luckily, it wasn't broken. It was just the glue. eaglemoss sometimes didn't quite put enough glue on, so it had little pegs So all I had to do was plug it in and put a dab of glue, and it's held, well, what, 5 years since? 4 years since? I don't remember when this one came out. It was pretty early in the collection too, because I knew it would be a favorite. I think that's the only one I had any issues with at all, and that, again, that was very easily correctable. I don't mind that kind of correction. Now, if something's actually broken, but I don't think I ever had to send off to get one of these replaced. Back when eaglemoss was kind of at their height and whatnot, they were very easy to get replacements. I did have to do it with a couple of Star Trek ships. And I feel like there was one other from one of the other collections. I can't remember what it was. Oh, yeah, no. The Nostromo. The Nostromo, when I got mine, the antennas were just all kitty wonker. They weren't broken, but sometimes when they would take them out of the mold, they wouldn't straighten properly. So when the plastic cooled, they'd be all kind of bent. But I got a replacement. It was easy peasy. But the Battlestars and the Vipers and everything really came out quite well. No complaints. I wish I could tell you my favorite, but sometimes it's actually the Valkyrie. Sometimes it's the original when I'm feeling like I want to be a kid again. Sometimes it's the Jupiter whenever I'm just kind of nostalgic for the series. But I'm really never not in the mood for the Pegasus, so we'll go with it. Why not? Plus, she's so big and heavy, and she sits on her stand very well. Like I said, I revisited a lot of the Star Trek ships, and it always makes me happy to revisit the Battlestar Galactica ships. And I've had a lot on my mind, a little bit stressed out, and doing this video helps relax me, so kind of appreciate you coming along for the journey with me. And with that, let's wrap it up. And there you have it, folks. I'm curious, what's your favorite Viper? And least favorite? And favorite and least favorite Battlestar? It's good that eaglemoss was able to give us all of the Battlestars and Vipers in the collection before it ended. Luckily, they got these turned out before they themselves ended. I got my final 2 issues April of 2022, and it was by July that they were gone. Of course, Master Replicas has picked up where they left off, but I don't know if they're going to do any more BSG. But if they end up doing the Revival series or something else, that might spur them to do it. I feel like we did really well, but I would have liked to have seen more of the support ships. Specifically, I'm thinking like the Celestra, the Berserk, and the Defender classes. Kind of military or quasi-military ships there. I would also have liked to have seen more of the civilian fleet, but I get that it really wouldn't have been practical to do them in the full scale and full price, so maybe they should have done the civilian ships in like a 3 or 4 pack and a smaller scale, maybe, 4-5 inches, kind of like they did the shuttle pack for Star Trek. Just a thought. Of course, we did get a few of the civilian ships like Colonial 1 and the Astral Queen. It would have been nice to get the Demetrius, the kind of garbage ship, the reclamation ship, since it was somewhat important in Season 4. And of course, we have the Cylon part of the fleet too, which, yeah, we got most of the Cylon ships, but I would have liked to have gotten the interim base star or base ship, and maybe a couple of others like the Resurrection ship or even Resurrection hub. But I understand eaglemoss's perspective. The Colonial stuff always sold better, and at the end of the day, we did get traditional base star, modern base star, traditional Raider, modern Raider, even the transitional blood and chrome, and even at the tail end the heavy Raider, which I really like. Maybe I'll do a Cylon version of this again too, since we're just kind of revisiting after all those need dusting off as well. I don't know. We'll see. With that, as always, I appreciate you tuning in. As always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.